Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to part 4 of our pest education series on urban rodent control. Before we get started, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping rules. Please, everyone, mute your line. If you become unmuted, please mute yourself. You can use the chat box to ask any questions, and we'll be answering the questions at the end of the webinar. For any additional questions that you may have that are not answered, you can email them to us at education@nola.gov. And the webinar will be posted on our YouTube channel, and you can find us by searching New Orleans Mosquito, Termite, and Rodent Control. Today's topic is the importance of rodent management, which is a comprehensive look at the risks commensal rodents pose to public health and ways to increase preparedness. Today, we have two speakers. We have Dr. Claudia Riegel and Rachel Denny. Claudia Riegel earned her degrees from Purdue University, the University of Georgia, and obtained a PhD from the University in Florida. In 2004, she became Principal Research Entomologist for the City of New Orleans Mosquito, Termite, and Rodent Control Board. In 2006, she became Assistant Director, and in 2010, she was promoted to Director of the department. Ms. Rachel Denny has been permanently employed by the City of New Orleans Mosquito, Termite, and Rodent Control Board since June of 2021 after completing her practicum here in 2019. She received her MSPH in Environmental Health Science from Tulane University School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine in 2020. Between her practicum and permanent employment, Rachel completed a year-long fellowship with the CDC in the Division of Parasitic Diseases and Malaria. Rachel works primarily in the rodent division here at Mosquito Control and focuses on collaborative research with industry professionals, but she also assists with day-to-day operations. And now, Dr. Riegel.
Thank you so much, Astacia. Thank you, everybody, for spending a couple hours or an hour and a half of your afternoon with us. Just a little bit of background on the City of New Orleans Mosquito and Termite Control Board. We've been around for a long time, since 1964. That's when the mosquito division was started. But over the years, we've acquired rodent control and as well as urban pest management. You can see a picture of the Formosan subterranean termite on the bottom right hand of your screen. This is our facility. We've been in there for almost 12 years. And we do a lot of outreach, extension, a lot of different types of work, of course, through operations, but as well as being involved in collaborations with universities, private industries as well. So anyway, thanks again, everybody, for spending a little bit of time with us. So we are responsible for rodent management in Orleans Parish. So that's all of the city of New Orleans. And so when you look at not only in New Orleans, but sort of across the country and the world, right, what is that urban rodent problem that we are, faced with and challenges each and every day? Well, first and foremost, contamination of food, right? So it's a lot of food safety. Very important. These animals urinate, defecate as they walk, it seems, and leaving their trails. And so the potential of contamination of food is very big. They can also do a lot of damage to property. Think about lines, electrical lines, for example, that maybe they're chewing on and can cause a fire. But you can also see in that upper right-hand corner, you can actually see those gnaw marks on that plastic. That's from on a garbage bin. Underneath concrete, for example, if you have a lot of burrows, they'll, sometimes cause a weak point in that soil and cause the concrete to crack. We're very much interested as well in asthma, right? Especially in children. So, of course, cockroaches are a big issue when it comes to childhood asthma, but so are mice and rodents. So very, very important. We want to keep those kids in school. And look, it just doesn't look good, right, for a city. We're a city with lots of tourists that come through. The last thing I want is anybody to see a rodent or have any kind of rodent infestation. So it just doesn't look good for a city, obviously, for sort of this aesthetic reasons. And again, very important, is disease transmission. So we always think about that as well. We've got, and we're going to talk about that today. There's a lot of information coming out of New Orleans that really documents the pathogens in our animals. So we're not the only city, but really these, when you think about an urban rodent problem, those are the things that is most concerning. We also think about it, right, there's a lot of similarities in commercial establishments. So if you want our grocery stores and our restaurants and perhaps even a mill of some sort to be safe and not have these issues. But, of course, we worry about contamination of food, and that's your food safety, destruction of property as well, disease transmission, loss of productivity, right? So that if you have to shut down a facility, let's say a state health department, sanitarians or environmental health workers shut down a restaurant because of a rodent infestation, that's lost revenue, that causes a lot of issues as well, bad in PR. There could be regulatory violations, right? If you have an infestation, and we just talked about it with fines, a loss of customers, loss of revenue if you have these rodent infestations to begin with. So the whole goal here is to prevent it and to remediate if animals are inside these establishments. So what's the state of the situation, right, with rodent control programs across the United States? So NACCHO this is actually 2015, but there's been also some other papers that have come out just recently from National Environmental Health Association, looking at environmental health programs, health departments, and also there's some work that came out of Vancouver with a graduate student where he interviewed a lot of different districts that do rodent control across the US. So really for in-depth, you can look at both of these articles. But some of the things that we, see is that not every city has a rodent control program. In fact, very few have rodent control programs, which is very concerning. So, and having the ability to take calls from our residents, so a 311 system. So big cities like New York, New Orleans has a 311 system, Boston, I know other cities like Houston, Dallas, they have them as well. So it's a way of being able to get the information from your residents. Funding levels vary drastically, from very little money dedicated to, actually no money dedicated to rodent control, to programs that are more robust with all kinds of resources as well. In some cases, they're public, like us, right? City of New Orleans, we're funded, we're a division department of the City of New Orleans, but there are also some cities and counties and parishes that contract out that services to private industry. The program specifications, as you can imagine, also vary tremendously. So bid specifications, if you are working in this realm, it's very important to get those bid specifications correct on the front end so that you're getting the right service. When it comes to outreach programs, health departments, vector control programs also vary dramatically. And, the tools available for surveillance and control vary as well. Programs, and we've seen this and we are really trying to communicate this, but programs often work in silos. So there's a lack of cooperation and communication with private industry and even in governmental agencies. And so that's a huge problem, because if you're talking to other agencies, you're able to leverage those resources, and folks are already working towards the same aim. It's really great to talk to folks and see how you can collaborate. So it is critical. So the folks on the call that are in the public sector, it's very important to understand your private sector capacity, right? So those are our pest management professionals. So for many of you that don't know a lot about our organization, we sit in the middle, right? So we work with universities, we work with private industry, we work, meaning the pest management professionals, we work with the manufacturers, we work with government, so everybody in between. So if there is a big outbreak of something that happens, I may need to work with the private sector in order to increase our capacity. So the best time for an emergency to prepare is not during the emergency, it's prior to that emergency. So this is why I'm mentioning this point. So let's sort of, now think about why we want to control rodents to begin with. And so there's going to be some terminology that we're going to talk about first. And so, we're very much concerned about zoonotic diseases, right? So these are infections that are caused by pathogens that are shared between animals and people. So when you think about it, of course, we're talking about it today in the context of rodents, but it may be your cat, it may be a camel, it may be, all kinds of animals that can share pathogens. So here's just an example that, cycle, right? And there are, in the rodent world, there are viruses, there are bacteria. So let's just use an example of a virus here. So you've got a rodent, a rat would be your vertebrate host, and you have a pathogen. And in some cases, you even have another vector that's involved, perhaps the oriental rat flea, something like that, and it's cycling through. But if we're in the vicinity, perhaps of a flea that may be infected, that flea can jump on a person, it could bite that person, somehow infecting that human, and all of a sudden now you've got a disease that has been transmitted to a person. So what makes rodents good agents to transmit diseases to humans, right? Well, one, there's a lot of diversity in species and habitats. If you think about the number of rodents across the world, they're often, very opportunistic, very important. So if you think of the roof rat and the Norway rat and even the house mouse, right, are commensal rodents. They're around us all the time. And so they're eating our food, they're taking advantage of those gaps underneath the door to get in shelter. And many of these rodents have very high reproductive potential. So you can have, as long as the food, water, harborage is there, you could potentially have a very sharp increase in animals. And they can reach pretty high population densities as well, right? And of course, we talked about how they like to be around us, essentially exploiting our resources, everything, we're providing everything for them. So those are those paradomestic affinities. And so in our region, depending on where you live, right, in the country, some places you're going to be dealing primarily and only, with Norway rats when it comes to the rats. And but other places you may be dealing with nearly 100% roof rats. For us, we're dealing with both. And so I'm going to show you some graphs and some information that we've learned while working with Tulane University and trapping. But we have both these species. And when I cannot stress how important it is for you to be able to identify the rodent or whatever insect that you're working with, because it's going to help you prescribe that treatment or those prevention plans. So if you look at the top, you've got a Norway rat. So let's start sort of at the tip of its nose. It's got a pretty blunt little muzzle. You can see the small ears, kind of a robust body. That tail is a little bit shorter, obviously, than the roof rat that's below. So I don't want you to go by color of the fur because the color can vary tremendously. We've seen very dark colored fur, and some are very blonde. So fur's not the best option. At the bottom, you've got the roof rat. It's a bit more delicate, a little bit smaller animal. These are very arboreal animals. They are in trees, they're up on attics. And so climbing those wires, you see that large ears, right? A little bit more delicate muzzle, but the factor here that's easy to make it identifiable is going to be that long tail. So if we swing that tail all the way back to the tip of its nose, it's actually going to pass it. So the tail is longer than the length of the body. So the house mouse is, I would say, very common, right? Very common all over the world. We do a great job of transporting these animals. They're relatively small as well. We put a penny there just to give some reference on size. People will always say, oh, I saw this rat, it's as big as a cat, or, that mouse, even that mouse is bigger than what it is. It's that fur, right? That makes it very puffy. And if they're scared or they're concerned, what do? All those hairs start to stand on the back of their backs, and they really puff up and look much bigger than they are. But for today's purposes in the meeting, we're really going to be focusing on those three commensal rodents. So how does transmission occur between people and these animals? Now think about it from a rodent standpoint, right? And unfortunately, rats tick every box here. We've got direct contact, so that's coming in contact with the saliva, blood, urine, so and other body fluids. So think about it where you are in an attic, right? And there are droppings everywhere. You can smell that urine. Even a rodent bite, that's a huge issue, or even a scratch would be a problem. Indirect contact, coming into contact where the animals have lived and roam. Oops, sorry, not the droppings on that previous one. Sorry, that's the indirect contact. But you're going into these contaminated areas. If you work in the pest management field or you're doing restaurant inspections, you really need to make sure you have the right PPE with you, especially respiratory gloves. When you get home, don't walk right into your house. You need to take that off, put it in the wash by itself, essentially decontaminate. Vector-borne also fits, right? So we know that many of our rodents have fleas, both the cat flea, not many cases here, but depending on where you are in New Orleans, yes, we've got the Oriental rat flea. We also see ticks occasionally. And then, of course, foodborne is a huge issue, making our food unsafe. And get lots of contamination here with rodents, potentially restaurants, and if you have flour, for example, or whatever it may be, cornmeal. So all of that's very important that we don't contaminate our food and then consume it. So why should we be concerned, right? I think I already gave you some ideas on that, but it's really important. And rats and mice are responsible for more human illness than any other group of mammals, right? Very, very important. And in the literature, up to 61, right? So this is a worldwide number, but depending on where you are and where you live, you should do a literature search. There may be information if you're in New York City or Seattle. I know Vancouver's in Canada, but all that area has lots of information. Baltimore has information. New Orleans has information, some information as well out of cities in California. So it's really important that you can go search and see what's already been done. And it seems as if researchers and organizations like ours are looking, it seems that we find it. So I'm going to kick it over now to Rachel. She's going to pick it up and I will jump on later in the presentation. Rachel?
Hi. So when we're talking about rodent control and basically pest control in urban environments, I think it's an interesting take to actually look back and see that this is not a new issue. It's not something that's happened, as of the 21st century that we're dealing with. This is something that's been going on for a long time. And I'm sure a lot of people are aware of this, especially because, you learn in school in Europe about the Black Death and all of these sorts of things, which, in that situation, we're still talking about rodent control. And in the previous slide, there was a whole list of different things that we've had to deal with in the past. So things, like fleas and lice and mites, all of these things have existed in crowded areas. Ancient Rome, there's a hugely popular, or I guess commonly known, plague that wiped out a large group of people in ancient Rome. In Athens, there's a very famous plague. And this idea of pestilence was something that was, or plague even, was something that was typically applied by ancient scholars to any sort of disease that was affecting large groups of people in an urban area. And so, obviously there was malaria going on in places like this. And the whole base of the word malaria is basically mal area or bad air. So at this period of time, people didn't really know what was causing these diseases. And so they were attributed to things like, a sin or a curse upon your town or something like that. And so it is interesting to look back on these cases and say, oh no, what control could you possibly have over these diseases if it was a curse from a higher power? Whereas, in today's world, we can handle it a little bit differently. So it's important to think about this is not a new issue, but it's an issue that has grown and changed, and the nature of it has changed through the ages, but we can be informed by these things. So on the next slide, there's a map kind of showing the way that plague was spread throughout the world. And it was an estimated 200 million people died worldwide from this thing, from, this little rat, this little flea, and the spread throughout Europe. And this is where we get the idea of there being a dark ages, is that number of people died and there was that much knowledge lost throughout time. And so there's a couple different forms of plague, and I'll talk about that later in the presentation, but it's important to keep in the back of your head that, again, this is not a new issue, but we have a little bit more finesse perhaps in the way that we can handle it, because now we know where these things come from. We know it's not a bad air. We know it's not a curse. And so when you're talking about rodent control, especially in the context of public health or any sort of vector control in public health, you have to think, how has the change in times and what we know now allowed for us to look at these things in a different context? And so in a current urban environment with lots of population growth and people living close together, these are things that were also causing problems back then. And in most recent years, especially in places like New Orleans, there's been an accelerated growth in development and urban populations, and there's a high population density. It's something we saw with COVID that people talked about a lot. And so when you have higher population densities and people coming around, and as Claudia said, rodents are living with us, and when we explode, they explode too. And so it's something that we have to think about and kind of look at this delicate issue of how can we protect public health and do rodent control and figure out where those things meet up together. And so there's a couple different things that can contribute to pest problems and disease in an urban environment. So something that you'll probably hear about in any basic ecology class, or people tend to talk about it a lot with protecting wildlife areas, is sylvatic frontier and land encroachment. So this is the idea that when we spread out our urban environments to try to accommodate for larger populations, to create things like suburbs and things like that, is that land doesn't come from nowhere. In the city of New Orleans, we're building out into a swamp. And so, when you build out into the environment of these other things, such as, mosquitoes or other animals and things like that, they're not just going away. You're taking that land. And so when you have this meeting point of populations and humans and all these other urban things, along with this sort of wild place, those meeting points are where you can have crop ups of disease or things like that, because there's this meeting point of all these different things we might not have otherwise been exposed to or thought about. Population growth, again, this is a contribution to how we're spreading out, and also an increase in population density. So we're getting more and more together, we're building on top of each other and spreading out. Both of these things can potentially contribute to pest problems and disease. Urbanization, so building more tightly together structures, as well as more things like food and all of that, and creating all of these resources for the people that live in these environments can draw in pests. Lack of infrastructure and increasing poverty and poor levels of hygiene. When you have to build a lot of structures really quickly, especially in areas where there can be very large gaps in socioeconomic status, buildings are not always built with pest control in mind, is the nicest way to say that. So there's not a lot of discussion between us and people who are building public housing and things like that. And that can lead to a lot of issues, as Claudia touched on, things like allergens or, childhood asthma, and just regular, disease and things like that. Access to health service. So this is something that can affect, people at lower levels of socioeconomic status, but also high levels. It can affect students, it can affect young people, it can affect people experiencing homelessness. And oftentimes there's a lot of things that go hand in hand with that. We call them social determinants of health a lot of times in the public health world, that can contribute to these things going unchecked and spreading in a situation that might become unmanageable if you're not managing other aspects of this environment. Resistance to pesticides is something that you hear a lot about in the news. We have some issues currently with the way that rodenticides are being used. And so we're trying to figure out the meeting points of all of these things where, we don't always have to use rodenticide, or you don't always have to use pesticide. We're trying to find these holistic methods of controlling these things so that all of a sudden they don't become ineffective. Not enough expertise or training in vector control. This can apply to both the average citizen and to pest management professionals. As Claudia was saying, we do a lot of training in our facility to try to educate both the average citizen and pest control professionals as to ways to use this integrated pest management method, which we'll hammer on a little bit later. But without training, how are you supposed to expect people to help? I mean, especially when there's little or no funding for a municipal program. We're lucky here, but not everywhere else is as lucky. And so getting this training and education out is very important. Lack of public participation, the public has to participate. You have to pick up your own trash, make sure your trash cans are closed. As Claudia knows, and many of you who know me might know, I and take pictures of like trash cans all the time, even when I'm just like out with my friends, because it's something that I really stress and is very important for keeping these things under control, because a holistic method of control is so important to sort of reducing this risk of disease and pest problems. As I kind of mentioned, new construction, especially when you're trying to build really quickly, typically doesn't account for pest issues. And then climate change and increasing temperature is something we talk about a lot, in that with changes in things like seasonal rain or average temperature during times of year, we can potentially introduce new diseases that otherwise might not have been here, or new vectors that can contribute to the spread of these things. And so it's something that we, especially with surveillance, you can try to manage. So just before we get into the I guess, true meat of rodent-borne disease, allergens is something that's important to think about, as I said, in the context of especially childhood exposure and like asthma. So an allergen is something, it's something that can be introduced to you where you have an overreaction of the immune system that generally doesn't affect other individuals, and repeated exposure can create an even like a bigger reaction. And so symptoms are often coughing, sneezing, itching, but you can also get sinusitis and asthma. And these reactions can range from mild to life-threatening. And so, everyone kind of knows about getting mosquito bites and dust and things like that, but rodent and cockroach allergens are very serious. And there's been multiple studies about the way that these things can impact childhood asthma levels and lung function, especially when kids are in environments that have lots of exposure to these allergens, like oftentimes public housing or schools. And so there's an interesting study done, and there's some graphs about it on the next slide, that kind of show this relationship between an exposure to allergens and then lung function. And so when you look at this, it's an interesting paper, and if everyone is interested in it, it's definitely one that I would recommend reading. But you can kind of see this relationship between exposure to allergens and lung function and other issues. And so if you're already, if people who are most vulnerable are already exposed to these things and having these issues, we have to worry about it, because that's public health. And, public health is not just for one group of people, it's for everyone, it's for the general public. And so it's something that we have to think about, that, perhaps increasing partnerships between public housing or construction or schools or things like that are things that we can do to try to reduce these issues and create a holistic version of rodent control, taking into account these public health issues. And so I'm just going to just overview some of the rodent-borne diseases. Obviously, as Claudia said, there's like 60 of them, so we're not going to try to go through all of them. But rats and mice are responsible for the spread of a number of diseases, either directly or indirectly. And I'll kind of go through a bunch of them that you might have heard of or would be relevant to us living in the city of New Orleans. This is just kind of another list of diseases directly transmitted by rodents. There's a lot of scary names on there. People think about hemorrhagic fevers. Nobody wants to be exposed to that. But there's some other ones that you might not have heard of. Plague, salmonella is food poisoning. Tularemia is like the infection of open wounds, sometimes transmitted by flies. But so this is kind of another list. If you're interested, you could go to the CDC, and they have pretty good lists. So one that people kind of talk about and that is relevant in the city of New Orleans is issues associated with rat bites or rat scratches. So there is an intangible cost of rat associated injury and illness. Oftentimes these things don't go reported, or they happen and people don't know exactly what's going on, but there's an estimated 10,000 rat bites per year in the United States, which that's a lot. So pardon me, I had to drink some water. Oftentimes the people that get that are bitten or scratched by rats are infants, where they have rats that go into the area that they're sleeping, because as we all know, kids tend to leave crumbs and other things like that. They're not necessarily the best with things like food or candy or things like that. And so these rodents are attracted to that food, and then they'll end up in the sleeping environment or bed of these children, and end up biting them when they're, around there. And defenseless adults, so elderly populations, also tend to be exposed to these things. And so something that can happen in the event of a rat bite or a scratch is you can get rat bite fever. So basically what happens is a bacteria is found in the teeth and gums and sometimes claws of rats. And when that wound is opened on a person, that bacteria can be transferred from the rat to the human, and it can cause these febrile symptoms that can be quite serious. And so, especially when you're talking about it in the context of, it's typically either very, very young people or very old people who otherwise might be immunocompromised or otherwise unable to express the issues that they're having. This can be a very serious issue. So it's something to think about, especially when we're talking about like pest proofing and things like that. Hantavirus is one that I know a lot of people heard about in the past couple of years. So hantavirus is passed to humans by exposure to urine, feces, or saliva of infected rodents. The rodents that can pass this here in our area are the cotton rat, the rice rat, the deer mouse, and the white-footed mouse. There are two different versions of the hantavirus. So there's the hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome and the hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. So they both express in kind of different ways. Hemorrhagic fever implies that there's just a lot of bleeding and hemorrhaging in the organs, and then pulmonary syndrome, which is a very serious like breathing lung issue. And so in the past couple of years, you might have heard about hantavirus because there was an outbreak in Yosemite. So what happened is out west, a lot of times there's mouse droppings or urine in that gets stuck in dust. It happens a lot in like grain areas or whatever, but there was a cabin in Yosemite that when they were cleaning, all of these things became aerosolized and people ended up getting sick from this virus that was present in the droppings. And so this kind of obviously was a huge thing. It was an outbreak. There were 10 cases and 3 deaths in 2012. I actually know I was in Yosemite when this was going on, and my parents called me and were like freaking out. So it was a big issue, and it was something that really hit the news, but it's something that should be really talked about regularly, especially out west when you have a lot of really dry environments and grain and things like that. And so something that's important to note that when you're thinking about hantavirus is that proper PPE is essential when you're cleaning up rodent droppings, because you can have these diseases pass that way. And so I kind of wanted to include this little infographic to let people know, how do you clean up mouse and urine droppings? There's PPE involved. It's not just, sometimes we get citizens that call, they're like, oh no, I was sweeping it up. And we're like, oh my gosh, please don't do that. But this speaks to the point of why it's appropriate to, wear proper, breathing gear, wear proper gloves and things like that in order to clean up rodent droppings and urine so that you can avoid the risk of, or at least reduce your risk of rodent-borne disease transmission. So leptospirosis is something that we think about quite a bit here in the city of New Orleans. It can result from direct or indirect contact with the infected urine of rodents and other animals. The bacteria, which are found in water and food, can enter through mucous membranes or abrasions of the skin. And as you know, in the city of New Orleans, we have lots of standing water. And on the next slide, I can kind of give you an idea of why we really think about it quite a bit. So this is an area in the city of New Orleans where water is being held. And I don't know if you can quite tell what's going on here, but this is an area that is very, very close to a encampment of people experiencing homelessness. And so what do you have in these areas? You have a lot of people close together. You have a lack of hygiene because there's not too much available. Excuse me. You have, lack of sanitation and all these things. And then you have rats, for sure. I wish I could point out one of the burrows to you, but there's a really impressive sidewalk burrow in this area. But so when you have all these things together and you have people that are probably utilizing this water or at least being exposed to it, that are that close together and, are lacking healthcare, are likely immunocompromised, all these things, it's a perfect recipe for something like a leptospirosis outbreak, because what do you think is in that water? I would love to know and also would hate to know, but ultimately want to know because it's important to, think about in the context of like, this is a water that all of these people who are in a perfect situation for something like a disease outbreak. And, from that point on, where does it expand? You always get more and more people. And so this is kind of this interplay of thinking about people who are likely disadvantaged and have all of these other issues that can contribute to health problems, and then a perfect storm of pest-related potential public health issues. And so there's a lot of places that look just like this in the city of New Orleans, and we're doing our best to try to take care of them. But it's something that, we have to think about regularly and why lepto is something that's kind of always on our brain. Claudia mentioned that food poisoning is something that we have to be concerned about. I don't know if you can see too well in that picture, but that's just a gaggle of rats on some food preparation services. And I'm sure you can, one, it's gross. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants to know that there's rats in your food prep service, but it's also associated with food poisoning. So rodents can spread bacteria when they move around, things like salmonella or campylobacter, and these can cause gastroenteritis. And most people will probably survive a bout of food poisoning, but if you're serving to people who have who are otherwise immunocompromised or have other sensitivities, or even just if it's a very serious case, like this can be fatal. And it's something that, could be avoided with proper management of pest proofing and things like that. And just basically, creating a situation where you don't have exposure of food or food preparation services to these rodents. Rat lungworm, pardon me, is something that's becoming increasingly of interest in this area as we have the invasive apple snails. If you have been to City Park or one of the other bayous, you've probably seen these big bright pink eggs and these big kind of like comical Disney looking snails. Well, we tell you not to touch these snails because they can be a host to the rat lungworm. And the rat lungworm is a parasitic nematode that is transmitted between rats and mollusks in its natural life cycle. So humans are accidental hosts. They don't actually transmit the infections. And this is a really good infographic from the CDC that kind of shows what's going on. But so we accidentally ingest them, but it's something that, the rat or other small mammals are actually part of the regular life cycle. But so if, these snails are touching something like produce, or if you're a kid and you lick one because that's happened, you can actually become infected with this worm, which then migrates to the brain in a human host and can cause a whole slew of issues with that. And so it can be fatal. And so something to think about when rodent control is actually reducing the amount of things like this in the environment. It's also why we say, don't touch the snails. If you see them, kill them, things like that. A lot of like national park or state parks and things like that have a lot of information about the rat lungworm and the apple snail. So it's something that we're starting to think about a lot here as this invasive species comes more and more to the forefront, and we know that we have something that can be the host to this as well as the vector. So murine typhus is one of my favorite things to talk about, which definitely is not something you say in certain crowds, but it's a very interesting disease, and we have a pretty interesting history with it in the city of New Orleans. So murine typhus, rats are the primary reservoir. The disease is typically transmitted by the oriental rat flea, or Xenocylogeopus, although there is some literature indicating that the cat flea has been implicated with keeping murine typhus in the environment, which there's some struggles that go with that, especially in the way that you could potentially treat for these guys. But that's a whole other story. So the causative agent is a Rickettsia bacteria, which enters the bloodstream when feces of infected fleas are scratched or rubbed into a flea bite wound or other break in the skin. So this is, again, a situation where a flea that was potentially infected by biting a rat jumps onto a person, bites you there, and that's how you get infected. So something that's a little bit interesting, especially in the southern United States and New Orleans, is we have an interesting history with typhus. So in the 1920s, the U.S. Public Health Service determined that rats were the reservoir for the fleas, or were the reservoir, and that fleas, especially the oriental rat flea, were the primary vector for disease. So kind of throwing it back to one of those original slides that I talked about, think how different that is than saying like, oh no, there's just a curse on this household. We were able to determine that rats were the reservoir and that fleas were the vector for this disease. That's huge. That's insane. It's so cool, but it adds to the finesse of the way that we're able to deal with these things. But so that happened in the 1920s. And in the 1930s and 1940s, there was an increasing number of cases. 42,000 cases were reported between 1931 and 1946. There was an unsuccessful attempt to control the disease using fumigation for the fleas and unsuccessfully excluding and exterminating the rats. So at this point, when they were seeing that this was unsuccessful, the Works Progress Administration and the U.S. Department of Health created all this funding and jobs for projects focused on reducing rodent and vector numbers. And to kind of think about why there was an increase at this time, especially in this area. So in the American South, and especially areas around here, you were seeing an agricultural shift away from cotton, because you have to think about what was going on at this time. So away from cotton into more food products. Well, if you're getting food products, you're shipping things to and for, and you're providing something that the rats want. So obviously you're going to get more, more little guys coming to hang out with us here. There was a displacement of rodents in other environments due to increasing urbanization. So if they've been living in, a field or a swamp out somewhere, and then all of a sudden you build your house on there, where are they going to go? They're probably going to go on your house. There was poor housing and poor infrastructure during the Great Depression, as you all know. I mean, most of us have been through U.S. history, so we kind of know how that was going. And there was a shortage of insecticides like DDT, which was used to treat for the fleas, and rodenticides due to involvement in World War II. So there was a reduction in trying to actively fight these things because the materials were needed elsewhere. And so I think these pictures are really cool. If anyone's interested, you can find a lot of stuff about the typhus, the push to get rid of typhus in the city of New Orleans at the Historic New Orleans Collection. They have a lot of really cool primary documents and things like that. And if you go ask the librarians there, they'll scan them for you. But just these are some pictures that kind of show when the WPA was like, y'all got to go down and control this typhus and control the rats in the city of New Orleans. They built this whole warehouse on Canal Street to actually devote to this. And so in one of these pictures, this man is removing fleas from a deceased rat. And then in the other picture, they're doing necropsies on a huge scale. And look at all those rats. There's a huge pile at the end of that. I think it's so cool. And then just a couple other pictures. So in this one, there's WPA workers preparing rodenticide. At that period of time, the main rodenticide was actually based on the red squill, which is a type of onion, which I always thought that was really interesting. And, sometimes we hear citizens say oh, an onion behind your fridge will keep rats away. And I kind of wonder if maybe that's where that came from. But you can also Google red squill. It's pretty interesting. And then just for a little information about how difficult it was or some context for how difficult it was to actually fight this issue. So this picture is from the wharf at the city of New Orleans and the way it formerly was. You can see that there was a lot of food, a lot of people, a lot of space, and just bananas everywhere. And if you're a rat, where are you going to go? Probably where there's a lot of space, a lot of harborage, and a lot of food. So I wanted to include this picture to kind of say, this is what we were up against when we were like, man, we really got to fight these rats is these kinds of issues. And it plays into the whole idea of environmental control is important. And so in the city of New Orleans, the history went on. And in 1945 to 1960, after this whole push with WPA to literally go out and just manually fight the rats, there's some really interesting pictures, again, Historic New Orleans Collection, of a bunch of men just holding 30 rats in their hands. They just went and killed. They used manual trapping, they used rodenticide, they used all of these things. And so it seemed to have suppressed the rodent and flea populations. But then in 1970, there was a resurgence in typhus cases, and that led to the implementation of a new program to target 5 areas along the riverfront where there was all of this shipping and the wharf and that picture with all the bananas. That's what it used to look like. So right now we currently have this beautiful walkway and all of these things. Didn't used to look like that. It used to be a mess. But so they created a program to target 5 areas along the riverfront. The goals of this was to use malathion dust to reduce the flea vector, Xenosilotropis, or the oriental rat flea, so that there was a number less than 3 fleas per rat, which they determined through some sort of calculation was be the amount of fleas that was acceptable to not create another typhus epidemic, and then to reduce rat populations using rodenticide bait boxes. And these are, something that we do today. And so in 1971, the wharf was found to be heavily infested with rats and fleas, which was likely related to the nearly unlimited access to food and harborage, as you saw in that picture. And there's a really interesting paper that includes using point counts, or where someone would just stand out and actually look at rats. And they counted over 100 rats in an hour from one spot, which I find crazy. And of these rats, about 50% were seropositive for typhus. So very important to get rid of them. Through 4 rounds of baiting with a nearly 75% mortality of rats, sections of the wharf were then removed. And so the idea behind this 75% mortality of rats rather than 100% is the people at the time thought, man, if we just kill all of them, all of the fleas are going to jump off of the dead rats and then onto people. And so they actually intentionally created a less than 100% mortality of rats because they understood that if there's no rats for these fleas to be on, the fleas are going to jump onto people. And so they wanted to mitigate that while still in that treatment phase. And then in 1972, this was so effective that there were 0 cases of murine typhus. And there was actually the creation of a funded and staffed rodent control program, and now I have a job. So it's a pretty interesting history that we have with rodent control here, and I do love to talk about it. Feel free to email me questions. For rodent-borne diseases, another one that, again, is pretty talked about is plague. There's a couple of different forms of plague. There's bubonic, where you have the large, tender lymph nodes, also called buboes, septicemic, or bleeding into the skin and organs, and pneumonic, so that difficulty breathing. Rodents are the primary host, and it's transmitted by Xenosilotobus, or that oriental rat flea. The causative agent is bacteria Yersinia pestis. So this likely arrived in the early 1900s to the US and ships from Asia. And there was a major outbreak in New Orleans in 1914. And I'm sure you can guess as to how we got it here. We're a big shipping place, we're a port city. And then the last major urban outbreak was in Los Angeles from 1924 to 1925. And there's this picture is actually something talking about the way that like a mass rodent extermination occurred in Los Angeles in order to try to mitigate this issue. So currently, plague actually still exists in the United States, and I'm sure a lot of people have heard this. It circulates at very low levels in the western US with prairie dogs as the primary host. But plague exists throughout the world still. And the animal reservoir for the plague includes mice, camels, chipmunks, prairie dogs, rabbits, and squirrels. But obviously the most dangerous for humans are rats. And the most dangerous flea, the oriental rat flea. We're doing pretty okay in the United States, but it's still important to recognize that, we might be plague-free, but this is something that still circulates throughout the world. And, we might have a grasp on it with our rats here, but that's not true of everywhere. So thinking about plague, it's important to kind of keep these things in context that is something that could, and, it could happen again. And so you have to think about it when you're doing municipal rodent control. And then scrub typhus is something that I have been hearing about, so I wanted to include it. It's transmitted by the larval stage of the chigger mite. A lot of people from the South know about chiggers, the little red guys that, come from the Spanish moss and bite you, and then you're just itchy for like 2 weeks. It's another bacterial disease, and it's something that doesn't typically occur in the United States, but it can go out into the environment from travelers who go from countries where it's endemic. So it's one of those things, we have competent vectors here, and so it's something to think about. In the same way that we have competent vectors for, Zika or other diseases that might not necessarily be at the forefront of us, but it's something that we knowing, especially with these ideas of climate change and all of that, and then having competent vectors, it's something to keep in the back of our mind. And then rodent-borne disease in New Orleans, you've kind of got an idea of what we do, but it's pretty poorly studied, and most state or even local agencies don't have funds for surveillance. We're really, really lucky in the city of New Orleans, and even that we don't have perfect situations. But Claudia is going to talk about a project that we did with Tulane that involved trapping these rodents to kind of get an idea of what we have, disease loads, and things like that. And it's something that we've actually continued on. When I was first hired, I was out in the summer doing, necropsies, and scraping parasites, trying to look for these things and continue on collecting this data. But we do a lot of other projects in conjunction with other universities, because New Orleans is such an interesting place as being a port city, having both species or all these species of commensal rodents, and they're pretty plentiful. So, we've done some projects with Columbia, with Tulane, obviously, with University of Richmond. And we're receiving grants for education and research from the Centers for Disease Control and the EPA. And with that, I'm going to pass this over to Claudia to talk about the Tulane study.
Thank you, Rachel. So some years back, so we've cooperated with Tulane University and other universities for that matter for years. And so Dr. Mike Blum was able to get a large grant. You can see how many people are on this particular project, or at least had worked on it. And he was looking at disturbed environments, right? From looking at vegetation and a lot of other sort of variables as well, land use. But fortunately, they selected the Norway rat as the indicator species. So at the top, you've got Bruno Gersi and Anna Peterson. They were the graduate students at the time, and our team was also very much involved. You can see U.S. Forest Service, a lot of other folks in this project. So there was a lot of trapping that occurred in the city. So of course, everything was done. I think 96 grids throughout New Orleans and one of the other parishes were selected. And there was winter and summer trapping for 4 years. So it's really important because you could see what was happening, you know, and you learned so much, right? In the beginning was really all about Norway rats, but that tune changed pretty quickly once rodents started being collected. But you can see there were over 50,000 trap nights. That's incredible. More than 2,000 animals were trapped over the years. Of course, they were brought back to our facility, measured, take all the variables that, data on the variables that we had selected, weight, et cetera, and also blood samples, tissue samples for further analysis. So the areas that are outlined in yellow are the places in Orleans Parish that were trapped. That's where those grids were. And the red indicates the Norway rat, the blue, the Rattus rattus, and the green, there's a few little locations. That was the cotton rat that was collected. So as you can see, this is just a slice in time in 2016, but there was a lot of variability. And depending on where you are in the city, you could have both species. You can have all three species for that matter. But, you know, we really are just focusing on the Norway and the roof rat. But parts of the city are predominantly roof rat, the northern part of the city. In our commercial areas, I don't think I have the pointer, but you can see the French Quarter area at the time was primarily a Norway rat. So it varied quite a bit. And so what we found in New Orleans is that roof rats definitely had a wider distribution than Norway rats throughout the city. So that was pretty clear throughout the study. And if you want to read more about these particular studies, there's probably more than 10 papers, peer-reviewed publications on this particular topic. So you can search for Bruno Gersi, Mike Blum, Anna Peterson. All of those papers will come up. You can also send us an email and we're happy to send you the references. And what we found was, depending on where you were, and we had talked about it, out of the 96 sites, right, Norway rats, we found them in 38 of the 96 sites. 3 areas had higher numbers. And so that's the French Quarter, the upper 9th and the lower 9. So those were the French Quarter, of course, very commercial area. And, you know, during this time still, there was still a lot of land abandonment in the lower 9, and the upper 9 has been, you know, number of empty lots and all of that has been remediated since. But only the French Quarter had more Norway rats than roof rats. So that's a really heavy commercial area. I also sort of want to mention, you can see the color. That's the bluish colors. So that's the flood level. So the darker it is, you can see up to 8 feet of water sat in those areas after Hurricane Katrina. But about 80% of the city had some sort of water. It could have been just a couple of inches to, unfortunately, all the way up to the roof. So it varied very much in the locations. So they were, of course, they were looking, right, to see if that made a difference at all. So flooding did not affect the occurrence of rats, right? So that's what was found. And however, more rats were trapped in flooded areas. So again, likely because of properties that maybe were still not maintained. But, you know, also they measured canopy cover, overgrown properties, mean household income, and debris, of course, that was on the street at that time. Norway rats had similar proportion of adults and subadults and juveniles during winter and summer, right? So that we look at everything. So when you trap, let's say you're doing trapping of animals, right? It could be from a control standpoint. You really should be looking to see, is it an adult? Is it a male? Is it a female? Is it a juvenile? Is it a, you know, very young rat? Because that tells you a lot of things on the dynamics of perhaps where they are, if it's a very young animal. But, they have a ratio of 1 to 1 as far as males and females. So you really need to take a look, and that might be good information for you. But again, very likely here because of that constant food source, right? So these were really more, Norway rats were more associated with these commercial areas. Roof rats had higher proportion of juveniles in summer and higher proportions of subadults in winter, right? So there was a little bit more variability. And very important, it seems like it may be obvious information, but it's very important to have that data to support, the reasons why you do things, right? So it's evidence-based program. So these lots were evaluated, and the city of New Orleans spends a lot of money, right, in maintaining lots, cutting lots, turning them into green infrastructure. So a lot of work is done with that. And so at the time here, and then we examined here the abundance or diversity of rodent hosts according to if a property was abandoned or unmaintained, right? And they also looked to see to determine if the management of the vacant lots could influence the abundance or diversity of rodents. So very, very important. And really, bottom line here is what was found is that if there was a property with high grass or really was unattended, you had a higher abundance of rodents and really a higher abundance of in diversity of species as well. So it really provides that evidence, right, for support of cutting these properties and putting them back into commerce. So very important. One of the things, right, that you just have to do as well as sort of look at what's going on with the genetics of these animals. So we have been doing this with termites for a very long time. You can look at how related rodents are. It tells you, for example, if there's a high abundance of alates, right, the termites that swarm in a particular area, perhaps there's less control that's happening in that particular area. So, and we've done work in the French Quarter for years and years through a project of Operation Full Stop, where a lot of control was done on subterranean termites, Formosan termites. And what we find is that there is less number of colonies that are detected in those particular areas. And so it's pretty interesting because there are some similarities here with rodents in that particular area as well. But anyway, so of course, taking tissue samples from these animals, everything is collected and it goes into libraries, and you can do a lot of analysis with that, especially looking at that population structure. Why do we care? Right? So, I mean, this is really important. So I always sort of equate it to pulling the curtain back and looking at what's happening behind the scenes, because we can see animals, right? If we're doing the day-to-day control, yes, maybe some rats or mice, whatever you're working with, the rodents are visiting your stations. You're even possibly putting game cameras out, taking a look. But until you really start to look at that genetic profile, perhaps the disease profile that's there, you really don't have a good idea of what's happening. Where are they coming from? Are they related to each other? Is the same colony? Are they, what's going on? So what was so interesting was that they found in these areas from all these rodents that were collected that there were about 5 clusters, because we were thinking about migration. How do these animals move around? And so what they found is that the populations that were sort of genetically similar was about 1.25 miles, or 2 kilometers about. And so, and then they were genetically distinct, right? So think about big roadways and canals, places where they could be cutting off populations. So pretty interesting, a lot of less similarity in the French Quarter, of course, and I think that's really, again, similar to the termites, where a lot of control is being put in, management is putting in, a lot of management efforts are putting into those areas. This is interesting. This is actually from California. So this is from Matt Combs. He did his work in New York City looking at Norway rats as well. And it was pretty interesting because they found something. He was looking at genetics as well. And that they found that the rats were separated by about 200 meters or so. They were pretty similar, right? But look at that 1,400 meters. So that's when they became different. So kind of similar, actually. What was found, they had their groups, right, in Manhattan as well. They found two main clusters of the Norway rats. They don't have roof rats there. It's all Norways. In the uptown and downtown parts of Manhattan. The publication is listed there, so if you really want to do an in-depth and read it, it's super interesting. But, you know, they found some neighborhood level differences, which is really interesting. So, you know, why control rats, right? I think we've talked about this a lot, obviously from diseases and all kinds of other issues that you potentially could have, and, you know, data that we can collect to sort of support the reasons for that management. The City of New Orleans Mosquito and Termite Control Board actually sits under the umbrella of Homeland Security. So much of what we do, if it's rodents or mosquitoes, we're always thinking about it from a preparedness angle. And it's really all hazards, right? It could be a storm like Hurricane Katrina, or it could be like COVID, where everything shuts down and there are hungry rats on the street. And, you know, we were able to do a lot of work to push those numbers down in those areas. So there's a very important role for vector control. So we're really talking about mosquitoes and rodents here after these all hazard type events. You've seen now that there are a lot of issues with pathogens, and I'm going to show you some slides here in a minute just to sort of confirm here in New Orleans, but we need to think about disease transmissions to humans and animals. There are a lot of displaced people and animals too after these disasters. You know, think about somebody that's been relocated on their property inside of a FEMA trailer, for example. So they're going to spend more time outside. They may be going into their property to remove the contents, for example. So there's lots of things. And then when we think about it, we want to make sure that it's not interfering with the response and recovery efforts, right? There's a lot of people working very hard after these disasters to put power back on or clear the streets, remove whatever it may be. And, you know, in the case of Zika virus, for example, you know, there's really a huge, obviously, the suffering on people, but there is definitely an economic impact from tourism and travel. You know, people aren't going to go to those areas. So we want to keep commerce going. And so, again, sort of looking at that two-lane project where, you know, we've got lots of tissue samples here. And so from those same samples, they were able to identify Bartonella. It's a bacterial-based disease, not likely going to cause any death, but it can make people pretty sick. And so, again, the prevalence was throughout the rodents that were collected throughout New Orleans. And we're very concerned about leptospirosis. This is leptospiras, the bacteria. And again, it seems as if you look, you will find. So very important. We're also looking at the ectoparasites in rodents. So we actually have the fleas pretty well done. We had a couple of a louse on there as well, but the mites get pretty tricky. Okay, and I won't lie. So we've got a lot of mites that have been able to be easily identified, but there are some that are so tiny that you can hardly see the features. And so we're actually working on that right now. We think what we're going to have to do is go down and use molecular tools to do some identification. But it's pretty tricky. If there's somebody on the line here that is a mite expert, please send an email to education@nola.gov. We'd love to talk to you. But this is where we're going, so we can try to finalize what mites are on our rodents in New Orleans. And so all of this that we've been talking about, right, really helps put it into perspective to what you actually need to do to be prepared for rodent control. Some of you may have already listened to the other 3 webinars on the series, and if you have not, they're on our YouTube channel. I really would encourage you to do that. You have to know what species are in your service area. You just have to. And unfortunately, a lot of people do not. We've actually conducted a survey of over almost 600 professionals across the country, and many people have no idea of what species are even in their area. So if any of these diseases appear, let's say, you know, people start reporting in the hospital, where do you even start, right? I am absolute, proponent here of having these well-funded municipal or state rodent control programs. All of us that are on this call, and I haven't seen the list, but every one of us need to do a good job at communicating to our decision makers how important these programs are, right? And what we can do and what we can prevent by having them. So your citizens really need to be able to report sightings. I mean, this is much of what I think Rachel was talking about, right, early on. You have to understand your infrastructure. We're in an old city, like New Orleans. We were so excited a couple of years ago where Bourbon Street, so many of you must have come to New Orleans, right? It's a very popular place to go. The city was able to renovate, I think, most of Bourbon Street. So that was the sidewalks all the way down to the street. So it was completely dug open. All the lines were new. When it comes to rodent control, that is the best thing that could ever happen, right? So that hadn't been done in over 100 years. So that only is going to help management because those sewer breaks and the other lines are no more. Understand your industry capacity. You may not have your programs, but if something happens, a disease outbreak, you're going to need to reach out to them. And then you need to look and see what tools you have available. And it's not, just the use of rodenticides, it's the use of carbon dioxide and the use of traps and how are you monitoring? So you have to do it all together. And so public awareness, very, very important. It is okay. And, we do a lot of communication. We work very closely with our communications department to talk about rodent control and do education to the public. So, which is really great. And of course, we're always working on getting that participation of that public. So putting all of this together is what's going to make your ability to react, right, to prevent diseases and outbreaks if something were to occur. And look, when it comes to hurricanes, unfortunately, New Orleans has had its share of experiences here with hurricanes, and rodents are typically not an immediate issue, but you need to think about it because if there is a delay in trash pickup, for example, and also just really sort of dealing with the hysteria. A lot of bad information generally comes out about rodent control right after storms. So the more information you have prior to that storm, and then you have the good communication of what sort of what happens is important. And so what generally happens, right, depending on the type of disaster, if it's flooding, tornado, things like that, is that you're typically going to see a reduction, right? But we don't see a lot of disease cases here in the US. Other places, yes. Flooding, for example, Brazil is a good example. In some of the major cities, when there's flooding cases, there's going to be a lot of leptospirosis that happens. But the rodent colonies typically begin to establish back between 6 to 10 months after a severe disaster, right? That's impacted the infrastructure. And we need to make sure that those interventions are in place so that, these people are outside, potentially in a FEMA trailer, wherever it may be. They're going into a house to gut the house, that they're potentially more exposed. And so this is a slide from, years ago, 2006 and 2007, but, of New Orleans. And this was after Hurricane Katrina, which happened in 2005. But, working with some partners and nonprofits in our group, we baited storm drains of entire zip codes because we had to. And it was, there was a real big breakdown in the infrastructure and trash collection. So we had to do a big intervention. And in all of these areas, we spent about 2 months. And every 2 weeks, we would go in, rebait as needed. So it's not like you just do a treatment and walk away. It has to be maintained. You have to evaluate. And so what we did is we looked at the sort of percent consumption, right, of the bait that was in that drain. And if that bait was consumed, then we went ahead and we added more. So the little dots here, the circles, the yellow is 0% consumption, all the way up to the darkest red, which is from 76 to 100. So again, just a slice in time, but it's using that data to drive those decisions. And so you've seen this already, but again, sort of looking at those species across the city, and then also incorporating perhaps the land cover, the land use that is there. So you really have to start putting things together to make better decisions on how you're going to address the situations. And we've talked about this already. And when it comes to Bartonella, we had done some preliminary work some years ago, and we actually found quite a few species, right, of Bartonella in those areas. And you can see the little red dots. So those little triangles are the areas where in the Oriental rat flea, it was positive for one of these species of Bartonella. And unfortunately, this overlays where we have much of our unhoused communities. And so again, the concern is there. And so now, fortunately, we've able to get some new tools, the use of carbon dioxide. Leafitech now has carbon dioxide in gas. And also there's an opportunity to use Bell's product, which is rat ice, depending on where you are. So the sort of the beauty of carbon dioxide is that, yes, you're dealing with those Norway rats, right? Because you have burrows, but it's also impacting those ectoparasites so that when you kill those animals, those ectoparasites aren't jumping on those people. So with everything that we have done, right, and it's sort of that preparedness, and I want, if you can, sort of look, at your own programs, or what would it take to start creating a program? You can't go from zero to a full-blown program, but you can do it in increments. But everything we do, you have to really look at it under the context of integrated pest management. It really needs to be that way. When you go to a property and you have issues with a particular rodent or infestation, you need to ask, where's the water? Where's the harborage? Where's the food? That's the first question you're going to ask. And then you're going to do your inspection, of that property and identify those potential, variables that are contributing to the infestation. We're looking at it not only from a property standpoint, but also from a city standpoint, right? So we've got a couple of projects that are going now, understanding the data, working outside of silos, working with our partners so that we can keep things in check. Again, we talked about it. Public education, super important. I will say it's very challenging and very difficult. Behavior change is super important in people so that, look, if your pest management professional is saying, please clean up that garbage can in the back, we really need that person to do that. So it's very important. All about sanitation, sanitation, and sanitation. Exclusion, rodent pest proofing, that could even be a garbage can, for example, that has a closed lid on it. So all of what we do every time has to be really under the context of integrated pest management. So hopefully today you've seen, right, that commensal rodents aren't just a nuisance. It makes me very upset when I hear, it's just a city. They're going to have rodents. No, we should not have rodents. It's not okay to have rodents inside people's homes, or they can absolutely pose a serious risk to human health and of course economic loss as well. So hopefully I think we identified that. There are also very good agents for disease transmission. They're very opportunistic. They live amongst us sometimes, right? Hopefully not. And they're also very adaptable. So if you are working in this field, you should assume that these rodents have some sort of pathogens. Make sure that you're following good PPE, washing your hands, doing all of that. But when you come in the house, your shoes, your clothes, all of that stays outside, right? You're not bringing those pathogens in your house potentially. And historical and current data, right, supports the presence of disease associations with rodents and their ectoparasites. We have antibiotics, we have, techniques to manage and, prevent, obviously, some of these diseases. Somebody may not be feeling well, they go to the doctor, they are not necessarily testing for leptospirosis or some other bacterial rodent-borne disease, but they end up getting an antibiotic broad spectrum, and that's going to solve the issue. So it's really important, though, that we keep our medical community abreast of what's going on. And, I think sort of just to summarize everything, it is so critical that local and state agencies have the infrastructure to manage rodents in order to mitigate, right? And also damage, as well as reducing that disease risk. So with that, Stacia, I am going to kick it over to you. I have not been looking to see if there's any questions, and Rachel and I will have our mic open, and we'll see what kind of questions are out there, if any.
Okay, I'm checking the chat right now and I don't see any questions, but we can give it a second to see if anyone's going to populate any.
Sure.
Okay, I don't see anyone typing, so I don't think anyone has any questions today, but I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon for our 4-part series on urban rodent control. Starting March 14th, we'll start a new series on mosquito control. And like I said, part 1 will be Tuesday, March 14th, and we'll be going over mosquito biology and the life cycle. So please check your email and our social media for registration, links, and things like that. Once again, this webinar will be posted on our YouTube channel. If you live here in Orleans Parish, you can call 311 to report any rodent issues. If you have any comments or suggestions or any follow-up questions, please email them to us at education@nola.gov. And this presentation is to be used for educational purposes only. Oh, Claudia, we do have one question in the chat now. Have you heard of rodents eating car wiring?
Yeah, well, they're not eating car wiring, but they are definitely chewing on it. And the answer is absolutely yes. And actually, I talked about it today. So one of my friends, actually, she lives a little bit in the country here in Louisiana. And she has actually had a lot of mouse issues in her vehicle, to the tune where she was just telling me she spent about $3,000 to fix her vehicle because the rodents had gotten in underneath the trunk. We've actually had another city employee as well. In his case, they were Norway rats. They had gotten into his wife's underneath in the engine as well and had chewed it. We actually have a great video. It was in the pest proofing presentation. You should take a look at it. And there's a video of a roof rat that's in the attic and is just pulling at the wires, right? So yes, they will absolutely chew those wires. They're not consuming it, but they're definitely chewing it.
Okay, thank you for that. Everyone have a good afternoon and thanks again for joining us.